Okay, today we are talking about Pythagoras, and by the end of this short video you'll see how I feel about Pythagoras. Let's see. He was born on the Greek isle of Samos, approximately 570 BC. Let's see. There's actually a town called Pythagorea, whatever, on this island. And if we zoom back, we see that it's on an island, and that island is just off the coast of modern-day Turkey, and not too far from Greece. We call it Greece. It's actually more of a part of the Hellenic civilization. The Greeks sailed their boats around and settled all sorts of places that they could reach, and they didn't go inland as much. So they sort of were kings of the islands for a long time. Anyway, other things about Pythagoras. He started a cult devoted to the worship and study of mathematics. That is my characterization of a cult. You can judge for yourself by the slanted things that I'm about to say about him. The followers of his must only wear white, they must not eat meat, and they must not eat beans. I'm sure you've heard of vegetarians before. Why couldn't they eat beans? Well, you see, Pythagoras felt that a kidney bean is shaped roughly like the head of an old man. And he was fearful that the bean might actually be an old man reincarnated, and it could in fact be one of his ancestors reincarnated, and he was terrified of perhaps eating the reincarnations of his ancestors who had been reincarnated into beans, and therefore he wouldn't eat them. Now, if you wanted to join the Pythagoreans, you must not speak for a very long time. I don't know if it was 2 years, it might have been a little bit less than that, but for a very, very long time you were sworn to secrecy, and I think they would provoke you and try to get you to speak so they could kick you out of the club. In fact, in the beginning time, you couldn't even look at the other members of the group. You could only watch their shadows cast upon a screen. Now, here's a very interesting detail. If anyone among the Pythagoreans came up with something cool, like a mathematical theorem, all the credit had to be given to Pythagoras. So we don't know if Pythagoras himself actually came up with the Pythagorean theorem, or one of his followers came up with it and, according to the rules, gave him all the credit. Now, when they swore oaths, they swore upon the holy symbol, which was the tetractys, or however you pronounce that, which was this sort of shape. Look at that! Isn't that awesome? It's symmetric. It's an equilateral triangle. It has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 dots. 10 is an awesome number. Yes, that thing is sacred. Beware of that. At one point, he trained an eagle to come to him by giving it food and having it come repeatedly. And then he went to the Olympics and had the eagle descend out of the sky and alight upon him in the middle of the festivities. The Greeks believed that the movements of birds, in fact the Romans did this as well, the movements of birds were indicative of how the gods felt, because you don't always know how the gods feel about something, but the birds are closer to the heavens than we are, so if someone says, hey, I've got a great idea, and then a bird drops out of the sky and dies in front of you, you think, oh, that's not a good idea. But whatever. Birds were symbols of divinity. In fact, when everybody paid attention to him, he raised up his toga, and look, his thigh was gleaming gold. The golden thigh. This was another sign of divinity. And what else? He believed that the earth was the center of the universe, and that the moon was actually... Have you ever looked up at the stars and thought maybe there's this big blue bowl over the world with little pinpricks in it that light out? Well, he sort of believed something about like this. He believed that the earth was the center of the universe, and there was this crystal sphere around the earth that rotated around, and the moon was set into it. And that's how the moon goes around the earth, because it's actually a sphere rotating around the earth, and the moon is just stuck in it. And on the next sphere around that, I believe, was the sun, and around beyond further ones there were the planets. Actually, I'm not sure where the sun was, but there's this one sphere outside of another sphere outside of another sphere, and the last sphere was the sphere that had all the stars on it. Anyway, nobody else was able to do this, but Pythagoras, if everyone would just shut up and be quiet, he could listen very, very hard, and he could hear the sounds of these crystal spheres rubbing against one another. And this was the most beautiful music in the world, and it's really too bad that he was the only one who could hear it. This is called the music of the spheres. You sometimes hear this term in classical music, referring to very, very beautiful music. He also reasoned that when objects have ratios, they sound nice. What I mean by this is, if you had a long tube, let's say, a long metal tube, and let's say if you hit it with a hammer, it went ding, 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 and made a lovely noise. Well, if you had a tube of the same thickness and the same material that was exactly half as long, then it would in fact be 1 octave up. It would not only, it would be ding, ding, I can't do octaves on my own. It would be the same note but 1 octave up. And if you had chopped this length into thirds, and you had a tube that was, you know, this is 1/2 up, and this is 1/3 up, that would also, it would sound very lovely. This tube and this tube, doom, 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 it would make lovely, lovely sounds. And similarly, and I think if you divided it into fourths, and you have a tube that was 1/4 up, it would have another lovely, lovely sound. And because of this reasoning and his appreciation of numbers, he began to think that everything in the world, not just lengths of tubes, but everything in the world had a number associated with it. And I forget what his numbers were, like God was 1 and man was 2 because man was pretty good, and women were 3, I think, because odd numbers weren't quite as good as whole numbers, and whatever. And the stars and the moons and caterpillars and everything had a number associated with it. And if you wanted to know, if you wanted to understand how things fit together, how caterpillars and leaves worked together, you would take their numbers and you would make a ratio out of it. And this is going to come up later, so I want you to remember this, that he believed that everything in the world was either whole numbers or fractions, and that the fractions were very important in understanding how things related. Well, next video will be his big theorem, or maybe the theorem of one of his followers.